Welcome, amazing people, to episode 56 of The Hopeful Majority. Today, I've got on a fascinating conversation guest, Wilk Wilkinson. The last couple of episodes has been me primarily providing some narrative and monologues and some fascinating topics, with the last one discussing the debate, the presidential debate. Yes, that spectacle that we all witnessed. And the episode was all about how to expose the polarizing tactics of our candidates. We're back to regular programming because today we've got on a fascinating conversation with Wilk to discuss how we maintain and have friendships during incredibly divided times. And importantly, how do we as people empower ourselves to unplug from the outrage machine, the division machine out there, and to change the way in which we approach our politics? Because, man, we've got a crazy election coming up. And a lot of us are wondering how we operate in our communities when things seem so incredibly divided and toxic. If you're new to the show, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we have great conversations. And what you should know about today is that Wilk describes himself as a blue-collar Christian conservative who spent more times in bars than he did in the classroom in his adult life. And he has found himself in one of the most fascinating friendships of his life with Dr. Francis Collins, who is the director of the National Institutes of Health, and he led the COVID policy creation for the federal government in a lot of different areas. So a big part of this conversation focuses on their friendship and what they've learned from that process. Two people, two different social locations, approaching a conversation in many different ways. And oh, by the way, Wilk also has a podcast called Derate the Hate, which you should absolutely check out. With that, let's get into the conversation with a fascinating individual, Wilk Wilkinson. Mr. Wilk Wilkinson, welcome to the pod.
Hey, Manu, it's definitely a pleasure, man. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, I was right before this in the prep when we were just talking. I said, let me know if you want me to touch on anything in particular, and you said, well, I hope to have all the answers. If I don't, I'll make something up. And I said, well, I hope it's better than our presidential candidates.
Yeah, well, and that is a dilemma, right? The people we have are making up stuff that none of us want to hear, so it's ugly.
So I have a lot of ways I want to take this conversation for your context. Last week's episode was actually me debriefing the debate. And specifically, if you remember, both of us were at the Braver Angels convention for the folks listening. And just to paint this picture, I attended the largest debate watch party I'd ever been to. It was a full audience with 160 people, equal, Democrats, Republicans, some independents. And it was fascinating to watch that debate with this audience, right? And I made an episode immediately afterwards that was not so much about who won or lost. I think most people are in agreement on who won and who lost, but more about trying to expose the tactics that our candidates use to divide us. And so this conversation's right after that. So I wanted to make sure you knew what you were walking into, what the audience has right now been thinking about. So as they've got that in their mind, how would you best describe yourself? Like, if you were to introduce yourself the way you first introduced yourself to me at that party, like last year at the Braver Angels convention, like how do you want the folks to know you and think about you as they listen to this conversation?
So that's a good question, but I would describe myself, as a conservative or a conservative Republican, or when I say normally, I mean back before things became so unbelievably toxic in our political environment. I still am a conservative. I still believe in conservative principles. I still believe in the idea of a constitutional republic and how we operate on that level. So a Republican or conservative Republican, I'm a Christian. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a blue collar guy with a microphone. So, I claim to be like this blue collar sage calming outrage, right? And and in the political environment that we live in today, in this toxic internet ecosystem and everything that we do, I don't like labels. And I know what principles I work on. I know what I believe to be the right thing to do, and what I believe the right role of government is. So I still call myself a steadfast Christian conservative, but so much of what politics is today is
Mhm.
not what I see as what politics should be in the country that we live in today.
Hmm.
Does that
So,
answer your question?
oh, absolutely, and you own a business as well.
Well, I guess my podcast would be considered a business, and
Right. Right.
my mindset mentoring, the speaking, some of the speaking that I do is a business. But I also still have a day job. I mean,
Yeah.
I have a full-time career that pays the bills, because a lot of what I do is more for the cause than the money that it generates or the revenue that it generates. So.
So the reason I asked you that is because you're a husband, a father, a Christian. You work a day job. You also do a podcast called Derate the Hate. You dedicate your time to this organization called Brave for Angels. You volunteer. Like, that's a lot, right? Why do you give so much of your time and energy to this cause of trying to bridge differences and depolarize the country? Like, why this of given just how busy your life is and given how crazy your schedule is? Why do you care about this so much?
Because the world that we're going to leave to our children depends on people like us that are trying to bridge the divide and mend the fabric of this country, to tame down the toxicity that so many within this environment that we live in today. There are more people becoming famous by keeping us divided, more people becoming rich by keeping us hating each other, than there are people like you and I, Manu, that are trying to bring us back together.
Mm,
And I think that's why the fight is so important. I've got a beautiful 4.5-year-old daughter. I've got an incredibly talented and impressive 15-year-old son that that are just these beautiful little human beings that are going to walk into a much more toxic environment than I ever had to deal with as a young man. And I want to fix those things that I didn't break, because I'm not seeing enough people trying to fix the things that I didn't break. So that's why I spend the time doing what I do.
I was just yesterday night, I was watching the Obama Romney debate in 2012. And for context, um I was 13 and then that debate happened. And so I had only heard about it, but whenever I hear people saying, things have gotten really bad, I'm like, well, bad to what? And man, I watched that thing and it looked like a puppy fight compared to compared to what I saw on Thursday.
Right.
And I'll tell you, at this debate watch party we were at Braver Angels convention with all these reds and blues and independents, I was sitting with a bunch of young people at the top. And the number one feeling outside of humor and laughter was just frustration at what have we been left with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When you think about this work at this moment, why do you think we are where we are? Like, the podcast question last week I asked was not who won or lost, it's how did we get here? How do
Mm-hmm.
you think about that? How would you explain that, let's say, to your 15-year-old son?
I think a lot of a lot of it is the genesis of a lot of this is that people just did not get enraged or didn't get engaged until they became enraged, right?
Mm,
They didn't even want anything to do with politics. It was a world in which, people were doing okay or doing well enough that they didn't have to worry about what was going on in Washington D.C. or things like that. We didn't have to, like, not everything that happened in our life was a national topic, right? We didn't have to deal with we dealt with things within our own community, but the speed with which information travels now is so much faster, and so the volume with which it travels and is hitting us has just become way too overwhelming for our brains to handle. And now, with all of that stuff hitting us every single day, 24-hour day news cycles, and people trying to outdo, every cable news station is trying to outdo the other one with fear, outrage, and grievance, and keep everybody just on the edge of their seat, or on as much anti-anxiety medication as can be manufactured. The world has become a much different place, and so we now have to deal with everything that's happening in the world like it's happening in our front yard, and where we don't have to, but it seems like we do, and it's very problematic. People are miserable and mean, and doing things that they wouldn't normally do, and saying things that they wouldn't normally say to people that they don't even know, and in doing so, the world is made worse. So that's why we got to do our best to make the world a better place, bettering minds, bettering attitudes, bettering the way that we interact with each other. And most of that starts with a good conversation.
Yeah, bettering minds, bettering attitudes. You said that people are becoming famous over their ability to enrage people. You having a podcast of your own and starting to speak about this work, I think a lot about this. I feel like it's actually the divisive playbook is super easy to execute. If you want to
Oh, yeah.
grow in social media, you want to grow your podcast, just say the craziest stuff, back it up with nothing other than anger and fear, and start throwing some bombs. And here you and I are toiling away in obscurity, trying to have nuance. Man, what are we doing? We could be so much wealthier doing something else.
Well, we could, but that's easy, right? I mean, the FOG model, I call it the fear, outrage, and grievance model, FOG.
Oh, interesting.
And with if you use that as your recipe, if you just use fear, outrage, and grievance, you will undoubtedly gain followers much faster than those of us that are trying to mend the fabric, trying to bridge the divide, trying to make the world a better place. And some people are okay with selling their soul, and I guess, I mean, if that's what they want to do, that's what they want to do. But like I said, I've got an obligation to my kids and my family, and not only my kids and my family, but all those that are going to come after them. And to me, there isn't any amount of fame or notoriety that is worth that. I mean, I used to participate in the toxicity and the online bickering and the and fighting with people that I don't know online about subjects on which I probably didn't know enough about to even have the conversation anyway. And I just, at one point, you just wake up one day and you're like, is this really worth it? Why am I doing this? What is the point? And
Why do you
I
think?
think
Why
this
do you
is
think other? Why do you think other people don't have those wake up moments?
I think people get confused in what their purpose should be in life, and I think people often, and I mean, I can't speak for anybody other than myself, really, Manu, but I think people get caught up in the perception of real activity, but it's not real activity. It's this faux environment online, and they think that somehow, I mean, I don't think everybody online that participates in stuff like that has bad intentions, but I think they are get caught up in believing that, I might be able to change this person's mind. I might be able to counter this person's point and change the way that they see the world. And I just, like I said, I don't attribute it all to bad intentions, but I think people just kind of get caught up in things. It's kind of like being the passenger in a car that just stopped to rob a liquor store, but you didn't know that the guy in the guy was going to go in and rob the liquor store, and now you're just an accomplice, and now you're in the car and you're in the high speed chase, and you're like, now what do I do? I got to do something. I don't know.
Not having any personal experience robbing a liquor store, what I can say is that you definitely do not want to be an accomplice. And one of the things we talked a lot about in the show is that people oftentimes feel powerful in that FOG model that you said, fear, outrage, grievance, right? So
Yeah.
fear, outrage, grievance, people say, hey, Manu, what are we going to do about it? I say, look, you're the one that ultimately clicks on the like button. You're the one that ultimately gives the permission to the driver of that car to go up and drive to that store, right? If you're filling their gas tank and then you're complaining and saying, why is this the case? I feel like we give up a lot of ownership
Yeah.
um, over the problem.
Hmm.
Um, Out of curiosity, do you come from a pretty Christian conservative community? Are sort of your friends or the neighborhood you live in, is it relatively from that political mold that you would say? I'm just curious.
It, throughout the course of my life, I've gone through, ebbs and flows when it comes to my Christian faith, and there's been times where I've been way up here and then way down here, and the community in which I live now and the circles that I run in now. I mean, some of them are, some of them aren't.
Mhm.
It's not it's not a big topic of conversation. A lot of my family is very religious, and then there's a bunch of them that have nothing to do with religion at all. So I can roll in both crowds. I mean, I like to, I often like to consider myself kind of a chameleon in how I'm able to adapt to different environments, and roll in different circles and have conversations with different people on different things, and
Mm.
but no, not on a regular basis am I constantly within that Christian conservative circle or even Christian circle.
I asked you that because I think a lot of people listening to the show oftentimes are in communities that are pretty ideologically one way or the other.
Hmm.
And because we're in those communities, it's oftentimes hard for us to investigate what our blind spots are, right? Because ultimately the people you surround yourself with are have the greatest influence on you as a person. So is there something you did in particular that allowed you to build a community that was relatively ideologically diverse? Or was it just the pick of the draw? Like how have you built a world in which you do roll in different circles and you can adapt? What is your advice to somebody listening to be able to do that?
Just engage with as many people as possible. I mean, that's the thing is, I've made the joke, or made the statement, Manu, several times, where I say, I spent more time on a bar stool than I ever did in classrooms, and that, I mean, it's not even really a joke. It's just the truth. I spent so much time all around this country going into everything from the biggest clubs to the smallest dive bars, the smallest hole in the wall bars, everywhere from the mountains of Appalachia to the east and west coast, and south to north, and just sitting uh, in these bars and just having conversations with people. Like I said, dive bars to high class places where it's ties and cocktails, and it's I attribute that, I guess, to my or attribute my ability to have those conversations in those different circles to that one thing. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to tell everybody that that's the best best path to take. Probably, number one, it's expensive. Sometimes it's painful, and it's probably not the best course of action for all people. It was the right course of action for me.
Don't spend your time in bars, people. Advice to you by Wilk Wilkinson. But but you said, as you said, you talk to a lot of people, you expose yourself to a lot of people, and yet it feels like in this moment when you try to do that, a lot of people feel this like deep sense of anxiety, like this idea of just rolling up to a bar in Appalachia, right? Or going to some dive bar in San Francisco, wherever the place, and just pulling up and having a conversation with somebody you disagree with. To some people, that sounds like a terrifying prospect. So like what's your advice to people in trying to develop that sense of vulnerability, or just hey, put yourself out there and have a conversation?
Start small. I so it's interesting. So I read the book, was it iGen by Jeannie Twenge, I think is who wrote iGen, and there was a lot in there about how the internet generation, or iGen, or whatever there's a number of different things that people call it, but how they spend most of their time online, and much less of their time now engaging in real life human interaction, human engagement. And it's a frightening prospect to think about how many different people right now have social anxiety about having to have the most simple of conversations uh, out in the real world. I mean, something as easy as getting groceries and then actually having to go through the line and have a conversation with the person that's ringing up your groceries can be absolutely terrifying to somebody. But I would say to anybody who has that type of social anxiety or whatever, you have to just start small. Start where you are. Have the the most minute conversation with somebody you don't know. Do it today. Just get out there, and if nothing else, just smile and see who smiles back. Share. If you see somebody without a smile, give them yours. I mean, it sounds cliche, but it's true, right? Smiles and bad moods are contagious. And the more you start to engage in real human interaction, the more that it's going to work to your advantage. And pretty soon you'll be able to do stuff that you never dreamed possible because you've spent all your time looking at a screen instead of truly engaging in human interaction. So I think it's incredibly important. This is another one of the things, one of the downfalls to society as a result of the pandemic response and people being locked in their houses for so long, and the developmental years of so many youngsters out there that just didn't get to spend a couple of those formative years really developing true inner human interaction, things like that. So it's sad. I don't think it's unfixable, but like I always say, we have to start with ourselves. Everything that we do begins with us as an individual. And if we want to change the world, if we want to change the way that the world perceives us and the way that we perceive the world, we got to spend some time in the real world, and talking to other people is where that starts.
So what I really appreciate about you, Wilk, is that you don't just say, you actually do. You've set yourself up as a blue collar guy with a microphone who spend more times in bars than in classrooms in his adult life. You aren't someone that normally comes to politics. And you're also somebody that has built fascinating friendships across ideological differences. And you took this thing to the max and said, hold my beer, because I'm going to go become friends with Francis Collins, who's the director of the National Institute of Health. And he was an architect of the COVID strategy. Not someone that would naturally be your friend, and you probably wouldn't be his friend. You built that relationship. And when I really got interested in your work after we met was I read this article in the Wall Street Journal. It came out in December of this past year. The title for everybody listening is Meet the Americans Trying to Lower the Temperature in Politics. It's in this tiny backwater newspaper called the Wall Street Journal. And so, it's only slightly important for people to hear. And I want to read the second two paragraphs of this article and then ask you to talk a little bit about this relationship. It said, this year, the logistics supervisor from rural Minnesota, Wilk, found himself on stage in front of hundreds of people, changed in his debating style, but not his political views. Next to him was Dr. Francis Collins, the former National Institutes of Health director and an architect of federal COVID policies that have divided the nation. Both men had come to believe that political animosity was a grave danger to the country. The scientist and the blue-collar worker, who said he had spent more time in bars in my adult life than in a classroom, were trying to learn from each other about their political blind spots. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably one of the greatest honors of my life, Manu, has been the work that I've got to do with the organization Braver Angels, and back in 2022, early 2022, the former head of the National Institutes of Health, the then interim presidential science advisor, came to the organization Braver Angels and said, "I would like to learn about the blind spots that I have with respect to how people became so divided over COVID policy. What was it about what was done that was just so out of bounds for so many people that they would not comply? And now there's so many of us on both sides of this issue that are just being subjected to the most heinous of things, death threats and just horrible online threats and attacks and things like that. What about what we've done caused these problems. The guy recognized his, that he had blind spots, but didn't know necessarily what they were. In doing that, Braver Angels reached out to me, somebody who had nothing to do with Washington D.C. and was about as far outside the Beltway bubble ideologically that any person could be, and but had also spoken out uh, quite vocally about the government's response to the pandemic, and asked if we would have that conversation. That person happened to be Dr. Francis Collins, and then so we met. We had an initial meeting, talked about what his concerns were, what he was thinking. Braver Angels leadership, David Blankenhorn, the president of Braver Angels, David Lapp, another founder of Braver Angels, and then myself. We all had this conversation about, well, why don't we turn this into a project where we can all learn from each other and bring in different voices, and not just have one guy talking to another guy, but you guys can be these co-investigators on this bigger project, and really dive in and learn. So that's what we did. And we started having these conversations, many personal conversations first, to just really get to know each other before we started tackling the deep issues. Getting to know each other on a personal level, about where he grew up and what his parents were like and what his children were like, and how he went from being an adamant atheist, and then finding God within the realm of science, which is a very, very rare thing in that atmosphere. And then ultimately, leading, becoming a part of the government, and then heading up the Human Genome Project, and then ultimately culminated in becoming the head of the National Institutes of Health. And then he got to learn about me, about my upbringing, and being a poor kid from the Midwest, and just this blue collar guy doing all these different things my whole life, and how I came to believe the things that I believe and do the things that I do, and whatever. So we built this bond, this human bond, on the common humanity of both of us, even though our worlds were completely different. Our viewpoints on many things were completely different, but we built this bond, built this relationship, and then we started working through our differences when it came to the government's response to the pandemic, what different people thought of the pandemic. I got to share all the experiences from hundreds of people that I've talked to on the subject with him, knowing that he is really listening to me to understand what I am saying and understand the concerns of all those people that I'd had those conversations, and then also understand my concerns. And then I got to do the same for him. I got to listen to what he felt and what he was thinking, and the different things that they had to experience at that level. The amount of the speed with which everything was happening, and all the different things going on, and whatever, and what we finally came up to. And we aren't nearly at the end of this project, Manu, but what we've been able to do together is have those conversations, and knowing that I am heard, and knowing that he is heard, and then being able to share and spread this with other people. So that's probably a very long-winded answer, but I think that's the best way that I can explain it. It's absolutely incredible.
Let's dive into this even deeper, because I think the friendship that you guys developed and the project that you're working on right now is a fascinating test case and a case study for people to better understand how to do this. What was the most surprising thing you learned about Dr. Francis Collins or his worldview as you've gone through this project?
People have tried to make this a very political, and almost a two-sided or a binary issue, along political lines, and it is not. And I think that's one of the things that I think bothered him the most, is it never occurred to him, from the conversations that and I will never speak for him, but it never occurred to him that this should have been a political issue. And that's the greatest thing that I've taken away from my conversations with him is it wasn't a political issue, and for him, he uh, is a true believer in many, if not most, of the things that they did based on the information that they had on at the time,
Hmm.
and and it really helped me to see, how bad it can be when people that have no idea what another person is going through, or the pressure that another person is under, uh, can ascribe motives to what that person is doing without knowing anything about them. And that's one of the biggest lessons that I've learned, not only in this particular conversation, in this particular project, but in my work with Braver Angels overall, is um, really being able to get to know a person, and seeing that these ulterior motives, or trying to ascribe motives to what somebody else has done without knowing what they were feeling, or what they were thinking, or what they were having to deal with at that time was. And
Hmm.
that's probably one of the bigger, if not the biggest, lessons for me, Manu, is that, our default position just needs to be kind, open our ears, and listen to what that person has to say, and then, and then try to move on after truly understanding, what they have said and what they've gone through.
And what do you think is, and again, not speaking on his behalf, but what do you think is something that he learned about your worldview that you thought was useful for him to know about?
Well, ironically, one of the biggest things that he said during that conversation last year in Gettysburg at the Braver Angels National Convention in 2023 was, um, he hadn't really, at the time of, and this actually went viral, and got him a bunch more hate mail, but at the time they were making decisions, they didn't put enough effort into taking into account how these things were going to affect the working class public in middle America, and how it was going to affect people like me and my family and things like that. And I think that brought, kind of a new level of pain and introspection uh, to him, and how he began to think about things.
Hmm.
Stepping outside that beltway bubble is a very powerful thing that I don't think too many people in Washington D.C. do nearly often enough. Um, but I would think that is probably the bigger one. Again, can't speak for the guy, but from the conversations that we've had, I know that was a big one.
What do you think it led him to be willing to enter a project like this, where it sounds like he's opening himself up to a lot of risk, and it seems like he's got a lot to lose, frankly, in engaging in something like this? I mean, he could go into a hole and just not investigate any of his blind spots, but he's willing to have the conversation, put himself out there. What do you think about Dr. Francis Collins makes him willing to do that? Or why do you think he's doing it? Because I think when we can get behind the why, I think a lot of people can learn and take notice and example from that. So why do you think he put himself in this position in the first place?
Self growth. I mean, quite honestly, I think, if you look at the body of work that he's done over the course of his life, and whatever, and then realizing, for somebody at that level to actually look within themselves and realize, I've got some serious blind spots here, and there are some things that I need to really understand to get beyond where I'm at today, or where I'm at with this whole thing that we did. Um, for somebody to look inside themselves, and recognize there were some serious blind spots there, I think it comes down to self growth. I do, because you're right. I mean, there is an incredible amount of risk on his part, and to do something like this. Um, and the only thing that I can see to be really gained is two things, right? I mean, he recognizes number one, he recognizes that he's made some mistakes and that it's very important for his personal well-being and personal soul to learn from those mistakes, which I think makes us one of the greatest pairs, because I talk so much about personal accountability and how every mistake we make is an opportunity for learning. So they think that personal introspection and how he's going to deal with his own soul, I think that's one. But then I think another one, which is probably which is certainly the more important one for society and humanity overall, is that he recognizes, as I do and as so many of the other people that I've spoken with on this topic do, is that if we enter into another pandemic tomorrow, Manu, in the same condition, or that's as bad, if not worse, than the last one, we're in worse shape today than we were going into the last one, simply because of the degradation of public and the trust factor between the public and the public health establishment. And to rebuild that public health establishment trust, to mend that chasm, that fabric, is going to take people like Dr. Francis Collins genuinely looking at what happened and what we can do better as human beings next time. And I think that's probably as much a driving factor as anything. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I do it, and I think that's one of the reasons that he does it. So it's not exclusive to somebody from the Washington D.C. Beltway bubble, or somebody from middle Minnesota, in blue collar America. That is something that we should all be able to get behind, a driving force that we should all be able to get behind and say, if this happens again tomorrow, where are we at? And based on where we're at, how do we do this better? Because the pound of flesh strategy and the hate and the animosity and the ugliness that is so prevalent will not get it done. And that means your relatives and my relatives and his relatives and everybody else is going to suffer a whole lot more unless we put our efforts into actually rebuilding that trust instead of dividing us. And we all know what's happening out there today with the politicians and the media and so many others. They are more interested in dividing us than making things better. And that's a real problem. So we got to do this the right way.
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger, I think, on something very important, which is the erosion of public trust within institutions, and the fact that if another COVID were to happen again, that you think that we might be in a worse position. A lot of these folks think we might be in a worse position. I mean, oftentimes when it's 11 p.m. or 12 a.m. and me and my friends are just like hanging out in our apartment, we're like shooting the shit and just like trying to talk about the different things going on in the world. One of the questions that oftentimes comes up along those lines is like, if something like a 9/11 were to happen again, would we all actually be united in our response? Or would we, would you go into the two different social media bubbles, see different versions of a video, see different versions of a theory, and would we actually respond? Like, I honestly don't know. And that scares me.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I've talked with some of the world's greatest minds on this. It's weird that a guy like me gets to have the conversations with the people that I do, but I'm going to give you two examples, right? Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, both good friends of mine. I've talked and spent time with both of them a lot of time over the past week or couple weeks, and then many conversations over the past couple of years. And one thing that we all agree on, out of all the things that those two men may disagree upon, one thing that we agree on wholeheartedly and without hesitation is the idea that if another pandemic starts tomorrow, we are in worse shape than we were going into the last one, and it's up to us. Well, not necessarily up to us, but we doing what we're doing have the unique opportunity to actually fix this thing and contribute to the fixing of this thing. And at that point, when you know that you're part of that and have that unique opportunity, it's almost our duty as human beings, as Christians, to say, okay, then let's do it. Right. And I I just can't stress to people enough how important the whole idea of depolarization versus enhanced toxicity is,
Yeah.
because I mean, when you start to back outside your own bubble and back outside your own head and look at the world around us and start to evaluate, what people are doing and why they are doing it, um, it really becomes easy to start saying, well, why don't I try to start making the world a better place? Why don't I start doing the things that need to be done to bring people together rather than divide them? And this is probably one of the most contentious issues of our time, Manu, and that's why I've probably spent so much time on this particular piece,
Hmm.
because this is the one that really makes the biggest difference. I mean, I can go out there and I can give speeches on depolarization and how important it is that we get along with our neighbor and everything else, and that stuff's all very, very important. And for most people, that's going to be enough. That's going to be enough to start that ripple effect to make big things happen. And, I always say it starts with us as individuals to make things better, make the world a better place by starting with ourselves. And those ripple effects are going to be there. But when somebody has that opportunity and that mouthpiece and the platform to do big things, knowing the consequences if we don't, it becomes that much more important.
So, oftentimes, one of the conversations that'll come up when you talk about people engaging in a process like this, right, where they're actively going away from their tribe, right? In Dr. Francis Collins' case, it's the medical establishment. In your case, it's the background that you come from, right, and the credibility that you have, that blue collar ethos, that it's clearly pitted against each other in this debate, in this dialogue. And you have two people, two parties walking away from their tribe to meet in the middle. That process of walking away is inherently difficult and painful because it opens you up to critique. People say you're a sellout. People say you're, pushing the other side. People say, you've lost your credibility as a person. Where's your integrity at, Wilk? Like, how do you respond to that? And what's your advice to an everyday person like me that goes out there and says, ooh, I don't want to go and talk to that person because everybody on my side is going to make fun of me for it, or worse, they're going to call me evil.
So again, real progress happens outside of our comfort zone. And a lot of times people make those comments and do those things and say those things because they are more comfortable in moderate pain within their comfort zone than they would ever be dealing with a little bit more grief by stepping outside of it. And and then because they don't have the strength or the courage to step outside of that, they are hurt, and they know that they've hurt themselves, and hurt people. So I just it's weird how it works, but when people don't have the courage to do something on their own, they often feel like they got to take somebody else down a peg just to make themselves feel better. And that's a very bad cycle, but it's true, it happens. So I always just suggest that people, like I said, start small, start where you are, and do things that help you to face your fears. Step outside your comfort zone and start to really do the things that you didn't think that you could do, and watch what happens. Watch the results of that within your own life and how that starts to work. Because when you do, like I said, I used to be a more toxic person. I used to be one of those people that would do more of that toxic engagement, and instead of really coming at things with a more positive attitude, I just contributed to the toxicity and the ad hominem attacks and the just that polarizing stuff. But I never felt good about it afterwards. I know I never accomplished anything afterwards. But I started to make real progress as a human being when I started realizing that if I just listen to people and try to find out, how did you come to believe what you believe, and how do you now feel about what you have done after after you've started to engage with those others that just, you know, that don't think like you? You know, do you feel better? Does it does it do something inside of you that you weren't getting when you were engaging in that toxicity? Because
Hmm.
I'm here to tell you that it does.
Hmm.
And it does every time. You know,
Hmm.
actually listening to people, and it doesn't mean you have to come to some milk toast middle, and it doesn't mean that you have to fall into the other side, and all of a sudden now I'm going to be some, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
You can still
It's not.
believe in what you believe, and feel the way you feel, and still ascribe to, and live the values with which you choose to live. But to open up your mind, and open up your heart to the idea that some other people can think different things than we do, and that does not make them evil. It does not make them a bad person. It just means they think about things differently than we do. They see the world in a little bit different way than we do. You know, they come from a different culture than we do, or whatever. Just because they're different doesn't make them evil. And as soon as we open up our mind to that idea and start to listen to who they are, we may change our mind about a few things, but don't be afraid of it. You know, that's what growth is about, right? So, I mean, it's one of those things that if a person is going to live a full and fulfilled life, they got to have an open and
Yes.
accepting mind. And it's just important to do it. And
I mean,
that's the advice that I'd give. I don't know.
I mean, you look pretty good. You sound pretty good, so it must be working out good for you. I mean, there's something critical you said there, which is that it's actually good for you as a person. And as we wrap the conversation, my mind goes to the fact that somebody in the audience is listening to this. They're like, "Hey, I'm here with you guys for an hour. This sounds great. Great conversation. Good job." And I'm about to leave this podcast and go out into the real world where there's going to be an election coming up. November's coming up. I'm going to watch some more Biden clips, some more Trump clips, probably lose my mind a little bit. Um, and naturally what they would ask is like, how do you maintain this ethos? How do you make sure that this ethos stays as it makes first contact with the outside world, right? Like, how do you make sure that people retain this through this election? How do you give an advice or feedback to somebody that says, I want to listen to people that are different than me, but I got to go vote at the ballot box, and that's going to tear everybody apart?
Well, here's the thing: is people don't have to make everything about politics. People. I long for the time, and I know you're a lot younger, so you've grown up in a world, and your formative years have been plagued by this idea that everything has to be about politics, and a lot of people, your age do. But I can remember a time where. Most people didn't ever talk about politics. They didn't want to have anything to do with politics. They didn't like politics, and there wasn't a protest around every corner, and there wasn't somebody on every news channel or every radio station trying to piss people off or scare them into hating their neighbors. So I would say this: if people want to really grow as a human being, you know listen to listen to the the Derate the Hate podcast, or listen to the enthusiastic, you're gonna have to edit this because I
The hopeful majority, and
a
we're not
hopeful
going to edit
majority.
it.
Oh,
And
Jesus.
and the reason why we're not going to edit it is because the hopeful majority is going to come for your ass, Wilk.
Right.
Everybody listen to this right now. Middle of
i
Minnesota, you know where to unleash the crowd.
I couldn't believe that. I completely blanked on it and felt like an asshole. Yeah, I was gonna say the exhausted
So
middle, and I'm like, that is completely the opposite of what we're going for here. The hopeful
don't
majority podcast.
don't worry, don't worry. I also expose myself to my worst critics, and it helps me grow better. So
It
so
does.
so so as a result, you forgetting the name of our show only reifies the fact that we got to build this thing bigger and bigger. So keep going.
No doubt, man. No, so back to the point that I'm making, right? So expose yourself to different things that you wouldn't normally listen to, right? I mean, the Derate the Hate podcast. I have a more conservative mindset. I do things a different way.
Right.
I'm a middle-aged redneck from the Midwest. You're a younger guy that has this beautiful
I,
hopeful majority
I'm a
podcast
I'm
on
a
Bridge
I'm a
USA.
I'm a I'm a brown nerd who's a perpetual disappointment to his parents because I was supposed to be a doctor. There's your description for me.
Perpetually disappointed parents.
Can you relate?
um, oh my gosh. Has your mom forgiven you for that yet? I remember that was
No,
one of the
man.
first conversations that you and I had.
No.
Um, she's like, "What do you mean you're going to be a podcaster and start what? What? Why?" Um, no, it's a beautiful thing, and quite honestly, a doctor can only help so many people, Manu. It's
Yeah.
true. A doctor can only help so many people because you can only get so many people in an office within any given day, any given week, any given year. The skill set that you have and the gift that you have to reach people and talk to people and bring out these incredible ideas, you are going to make so many more differences with the Hopeful Majority podcast and Bridge USA and the work that we do together and the ways that we can collaborate to change the world and change the way people look at these contentious topics. You know,
Yeah.
it's a lot of people can be doctors, and a lot of doctors will tell you that more people, more people could be doctors, but not everybody can do what you're doing.
I
Not
appreciate that.
everybody can reach the people the way that you reach the people. So, um, yeah,
And you work with two doctors.
I
They're,
work with
they're
a
two of
lot
your
more.
friends.
Yeah. No, actually, a lot more than that. It's if I told you the number of like Ivy League professors, intellectual elites, these
Sure.
people that I would have never ever or nobody would have ever guessed that I would be having conversations with, Manu, it would blow your mind, and I know it would blow your mind because it blows my mind every
I
time.
bet.
Every
I
time
bet.
one of them calls my phone or emails me or wants me to review something that I don't know half the words in. I mean, it's like it is absolutely amazing. But you know what? It means we're making progress, right? It
Yes.
means that we're
Yes.
actually doing something meaningful and good things are happening. And like I said, so with that being said, back to the advice portion, right? I mean, expose yourself to stuff that you wouldn't normally do. If you're a conservative, expose yourself to a liberal podcast. If you're a liberal, expose yourself to a conservative podcast. Um, and then start small. When it comes to that real human interaction stuff, start having conversations and remember that not everything has to be made political, but every time you interact with another human being in real life instead of this faux internet ecosystem that so many people live in, the better your life is going to be. We are social creatures. We absolutely have to have real social human interaction to make uh, ourselves complete.
Mhm.
And being that social creature and engaging in society in a meaningful way, we can turn this thing around. But it takes a little bit from everybody, and that doesn't mean everybody has to go out and be some wild social butterfly. But it does mean that we all have to live together. We've got one go round on this rock together, and in order to make it the best go round that's possible, we got to get out there and engage with each other.
Thanks for coming on the Hopeful Majority, Wilk.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much to Wilk for joining the Hopeful Majority. Thank you for tuning in. As you know, every week we release these conversations because I believe that you and I together are building this majority of individuals that are not defined by an ideology, but defined by temperament, a mindset. We're the hopeful majority of people. We believe we got to be open minded, have difficult conversations. And boy, did Wilk demonstrate that. And I thought that was a fascinating way to understand, explore not only how we as people have better conversations with people we disagree with, but that here's the kicker. It's actually good for us as individuals. I think Wilk did a fascinating job making that case. Hey, look, I'll see you next week, Monday. Every Monday, we drop amazing content. We're building this together. You and I, if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're on Spotify, Apple, please leave a review. Please rate the episode, because that's how we grow this thing together. With that, my friends, I'll see you next week.